Alright, today we'll be hauling the engine out of the Subaru. So, like any engine, there's 6 things you need to do before you can actually lift the engine out. You need to unhook your intake and your exhaust. You need to disconnect your coolant system and all your accessories like your power steering pump, your AC compressor, and your alternator. And then once you have that done, disconnect your fuel system, usually just the 2 lines going to the engine, and all the mounts and your bell housing. Once you do that, you're ready to haul the engine out. So we'll get started and haul the intake off first. Alright, so pulling the air intake on these is quite simple. You just got to loosen, there's 2 hose clamps on this hose here, and then you can just pop that right out. You want to unplug your mass airflow sensor, and you can pull this. There's 1 nut on the back of this air box, and then you can kind of fish that out. It does on one side clamp onto the power steering lines, so you'll have to wiggle it off of that. And then there's just 2 bolts that hold this top breather section in, hose clamp to the throttle body, and this little vacuum hose here. Just pull that straight off, take your 2 bolts out, and loosen up this hose clamp. And then if you kind of roll it upward, I find is the easiest way to pop it off. Get it loose, and then you see these 2 hoses here. Pull the clamps and pop those off. And that's the intake system removed. So before you go under the car and unbolt the manifold, you're going to want to make sure you disconnect both these O2 sensors. The plugs are different on them, so you don't have to worry about marking them or getting them mixed up or anything like that. And there's a little clip on each one down here by the converter. You want to unclip those, and then it'll be able to fall down. And usually I'll unbolt the transmission mount first for the exhaust, which looks like this. It sits on the passenger side. A lot of times that bolt that goes through the bottom will get seized up, so it's usually easier to take the 2 bolts out of the top here, out of the transmission. But if you can get that bottom bolt out, then that is the best way to do it. And then you climb underneath the car here. And there's 3 bolts on each side of the engine. They're 14 millimeter. You spin those out, and then you can drop the exhaust down. If you're just pulling the engine, this is fine. You can just leave it how it is here. I find it's easier to unbolt it at the center pipe and just take the exhaust right out of the way. Alright, now you're going to want to make sure your battery is disconnected before you go any further and start touching any of your alternator cables or any of the wiring. So once you get that disconnected, you can come in here and take the belt off the front, so you can take the power steering pump and the alternator off. So there's a 12 millimeter bolt down in this tensioner, and then all these bolts are going to be 12 millimeter. Take this bolt all the way out, and that'll loosen your alternator. And then with that out, then your bracket and the alternator are separate, so you can pull the power steering out just off of the bracket instead of needing to unbolt the pump. So there's 2 more 12 millimeter bolts just underneath the pulley on the bottom side. So you're going to want to take your belt off before you try and get those. Pop the belt off quite easy. I already have the 2 front bolts on the power steering pump out, so I'll get this rear bolt out. Once that's out, you can wiggle it around a bit and try and get this plug undone in the back. It can be kind of a nuisance sometimes. And yes, you also want to make sure this bolt has been removed from the alternator. And then this tensioner piece just comes right out. Your power steering pump, you can lift that up Just kind of drape that over the side of the car, and then that's done. You don't have to worry about draining, rebleeding your power steering. And then for the alternator, another 12mm nut to remove your power stud. Take that off, and there's a plug in the back. Unplug that. And then this obviously doesn't have an AC compressor, but there's another plug in the back. You want to disconnect those, and then you can put that to the side as well. Keep that out of your way. And then you're going to want to pull the alternator out, because this bolt will be in the way. And this also holds your AC compressor on as well. So there's a couple other bolts that hold that on. And you can do that once you get the front belt off. You can take the AC belt and tensioner and everything off. Alright, so now we're going to come in here at the back of the engine on the driver's side. And we're going to remove the starter. There's 14mm bolt top and bottom, and a 12mm nut on the back holding the power wire on. You'll want to break that free before you remove the starter bolts. Then you can just spin the nut off the back. And I'll pull the starter out so you can see how it goes on. That's where the power wire comes from. And then you also have a little signal wire that goes onto this tab here. You have to unplug that as well so you don't rip the cable out of it. And we're also going to take off the slave cylinder for the clutch. Just take the two bolts out there. That ground wire that's on the bolt, that's typically on the top starter bolt, but that bolt broke, which is why I'm pulling the engine out to pull that stud and put a new bolt in. So I just put it onto the slave cylinder for now. Take that out. Just put that up behind this wire and harness out of the way. So now we'll come back to the firewall, and you have your two coolant hoses going to your heater core. So you want to pinch these clamps, slide them back, and then gently twist the hose until it comes loose. And the trick for these is if you take your 1/2 inch or 12mm socket, 3/8 drive, you can pull the hose off and put your socket in the end of the hose. And then if you pull your other hose off the same way, you'll leak a bit of coolant, but you can put both ends on either side of the socket, and then you can leave the whole coolant system hooked up. Then you won't have to worry about opening up the coolant system. You can leave that just like that so it doesn't leak out of the back. And then in the front here, I'm actually going to leave the radiator and the hoses on the engine. I'll just strap it forward after I pull the rad fans out, and then it'll be able to come clear out of the engine bay. So now normally you would drain the radiator, you take the radiator hoses off, or on some there's a drain on the bottom. This is an aftermarket rad, doesn't come with a drain, so you just have to pull the hoses off to drain it. So you take the top and lower hose off down there and just pull them off, let the system drain. If you need to do any sort of engine work, or you're replacing the engine, or you need to do water pump, anything like that. But we don't need to drain the coolant system. I'm not going to be opening the motor up or anything. So there's 4 bolts here across the fans. I'm just going to take the fans out of the way, and then I can pull the radiator in close to the engine, just tie a strap around it, and then I can lift it up with the radiator. The bolt behind this coolant bottle, you'll have to take that reservoir out of the way. So you just take this overflow hose, pull that out of the bottle, and there's a little push tab on this piece of plastic. You push that in, the container slides off, and then you can take the bolt out and just pop it back in. So then the fans, you just pop the top out a little bit, lift it up and the bottom will swing out, and then you can drop them right down through the bottom. But you want to take the passenger one first because the bottom radiator hose will be in the way. So for each radiator fan on the outer side towards the tire, you can see right there, there's a plug for each fan, so you're going to want to unplug those before you take them off. Alright, so before we get the engine up in the air, we're going to go around and disconnect all the wiring. On this, it's just one big plug right here. There's a push down tab on the clip. Fold this out. Your plug will pull out. There's a clip on the metal bracket. It goes in here. You have to pull that out, and then both of these clips to the transmission are secured on this little metal tab here. So you can just undo all those, and then your entire wiring harness is disconnected. You just have to go around and find any ground wires. See, there's one here, another one here. You want to go around, disconnect all your grounds, and then we'll be ready to undo the mounts and break it off the transmission. Alright, so now we'll come back under the car, and you have your two motor mount nuts right here. So you'll want to spin those off, and then you'll see the stud sticks through the frame on it. So what you're going to want to do is jack the engine up to get that clear before you can pull the engine off of the transmission. So I just went ahead and loosened the bolts in the transmission mount. Just drop them down about 1/4 inch so you can get the studs up out of those holes, and then you'll be good to take all your bell housing bolts off and split it apart. Alright, now we got the engine up in the air. You have the jack under the front of the transmission to support that, with the crane on the engine. So I'll take the fuel lines off next. I'll pull these covers off the radiator so that can lift up with the engine. So for the bell housing, there's 3 bolts on each side, and on the bottom there's a nut on each side. 2 of the bolts come out with your starter, so there should be a bolt and a nut on your driver's side, and then 3 bolts and a nut on the passenger side to take out, and then you can split the engine apart and start lifting it out. Alright, now that everything's unhooked and unbolted, you can see right here there's a little opening at the top where the engine started to let go. Sometimes it'll get stuck together on the dowel pins, and you'll have to take a flathead and kind of beat it down in between the 2 cases to open them. But this one just let go, so I'll just open it a little bit with the screwdriver. And I can fit my pry bar down in the side. And you want to very gently pry it. Lift the engine up a little bit. Sometimes it takes a little bit of wiggling to get it out at the right angle. But once it's split apart that far, you should be able to grab the whole engine, pull it forward. Then you can lift it out. Usually want to go up a little bit with it. And then you can swing the engine around and just look around, make sure you're not missing any wiring or any hoses or anything. Make sure everything's free. You can see how I have the radiator coming up with the engine. So that way I don't have to completely drain the coolant system and all that. So there you go, the engine's out. There's a few things on these particular engines I would suggest while you have it out, such as your PVC valve here that is located right here on the back of the engine on one of the air hoses going up to your intake manifold right by the throttle body. These will often get plugged up and overlooked, and they'll cause a lot of leaks on your engine. You'll also want to take the clutch off if it's a standard. Check your rear main seal. If you're not pulling the clutch off, you have to watch out for this. Your pilot bearing can sometimes fall out when you pull it, so you have to make sure you gently push that back in. And the timing is known to be a bit of an issue in these cars if you don't keep up on it. So on the left side of the engine here, there's 3 bolts, all plastic cover off, and kind of inspect the condition of your timing belt. And you definitely want to change that if it's time. It's just easier to do it while the engine's out of the car. Thanks for watching, hope this helps.